Welcome back to the four-part series on the origins of ancient Israel here at Beit Avichai. Last week, or the previous sessions, we dealt with, first of all, an introduction to how the Hebrew Bible is organized and what its intentions were. We talked about archaeological method and theory a little bit. Our next session dealt with an earlier period, the period of the patriarchs, the patriarchal narrative, and how that meshes with the archaeological evidence. Today, what we're going to do is move forward in time, progressing with the biblical text, and we'll take a certain vignette, the story of the tribe of Dan. We will look at it from different perspectives. The main question we're asking here is, who were the Danites? And in this picture, you're seeing an aerial photograph of Tel Dan up in northern Israel from the air. So first of all, we're going to start with the biblical account. We're going to look at the biblical text and how it relates to Tel Dan, and then we're going to move on into the archaeology. So let's start with the biblical text, and we'll take this in order of the verses and the chapters. So starting off in Genesis, Dan is mentioned first as one of the tribes of Israel, one of the sons of Jacob, and we are given what's called a midrash shem, the explanation for the name. And Dan is the name given, and God hath judged me, and hath heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore, she called his name Dan. And this is because the root in Hebrew of Dan means to judge. Dan shall judge his people. But also, we are told that Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a horned snake in a path, a viper, if you will. And that's not very nice. So the biblical author here is saying Dan is sort of a menace as well. It's not just a really nice tribe. These two things led to the symbols of the tribe of Dan being a balanced weight on the one hand and a snake on the other. If we move forward in the biblical text, we come to Exodus chapter 35. And here we are told that when the tabernacle is being constructed in the desert according to very detailed instructions, and this would probably belong to the P book of the Deuteronomistic historian, or the P book of the documentary hypothesis, Dan is mentioned as a tribe that has expertise in crafts, especially things that have to do with metalworking. And I want you to remember that, because when we get to the archaeology later on, you'll see that the biblical authors probably had something in mind. So a tribe of Dan one of the people of tribe of Dan was responsible for building part of the ark's appurtenances. If we move a lot further in the text, we go to Chronicles, which is sort of a rehash of a lot of the things that are in the book of Kings. We are told that there is a guy named Huram Abi who is a man of great skill, whose mother was from Dan and whose father was from Tyre. So there's a northern connection here between Tyre and Dan. And once again, we're looking at great skill and things that have to do with gold, silver, bronze, and iron, all kinds of materials that the Danites are good with. Moving ahead, we get to the book of Joshua. And in this portion of the book of Joshua, the apportionment of the land of Israel to the different tribes is laid out, and everybody gets their portions, and it's very detailed as far as what tribe is located where. And in this picture, we're seeing that the tribe of Dan is located according to the biblical description. And again, looking at the text, there's a great deal of detail, which settlements form the borders between the different tribes. Dan is located in what is called today Gush Dan, the area of Tel Aviv, a little further inland, up to the Shfela, including Beit Shemesh, Eshtaol, and places like that. Now, this is the way it was originally. This was the original allotment according to the book of Joshua. But when we go forward in time, there is what the English translators have put here in parentheses. When the territory of the Danites was lost to them, they went up and attacked Leshem and took it and put it to sword and occupied it. They settled in Leshem and named it Dan after their ancestors. So we are told already, we're giving a preview of what's going to happen later on, that the Danites moved from the original inheritance up north. There's the arrow. Moving forward into the book of Judges, the earlier part of the book of Judges, the so-called Song of Deborah, which is a very ancient portion of the Hebrew Bible. When the battle is being executed against the Canaanites, the song talks about various tribes and regions, what they did and did not do. And here we are told, Dan, why did he abide with the ships? And that's sort of interesting. What Hebrew tribe has ships? They're clearly associated with the coast and with maritime affairs. And they're probably the only tribe that is made specific about. Asher sits by the coast of the sea, settling down by his landings. But Dan has ships. Of course, you probably recognize this guy and this gal, Samson and Delilah, of course. Samson is probably the most prominent Danite in the Hebrew text. And Samson's an interesting character. He's very strong. He cavorts with Philistine women. He tells riddles. He is really a Greek Hellenic hero. There's nobody like him in the Hebrew Bible. And this has led some people to suggest that the Samson narrative, the Samson story, is actually not originally part of the ancient Near Eastern milieu. It comes from the Greek world, the Hellenic world. People like Yigal Yadin, Michael Astor, and later on Othniel Marguerite wrote about all these characteristics and suggested maybe the Danites are not originally from the Levant or the ancient Near East. Maybe they are originally from the Aegean milieu or Cyprus or something like that. Keep that in mind because we're going to examine that hypothesis later on, especially via the archaeology. The largest or most detailed description of what the Danites do and what they don't do is located in Judges 18. And this is the narrative about the Danite migration from their original inheritance in the south, the area of the Shvela and Tel Aviv, up north to where Tel Dan is located today. This starts with the catchphrase, "In those days, Israel had no king." In other words, when this is being written down, there already was a king. According to the biblical chronology, that would already mean within the text itself that this is being written down a couple hundred years at least after the events it means to portray. And so the Danites are looking for, I'm not going to read the whole thing through because it's quite long. I really would recommend all of you opening up the book, read Judges 18 because it's a fascinating account. It would make a good Hollywood film. So the Danites are looking for a place to settle, and they send out 5 of their leading men. Basically, they're spies, like we heard about in the book of Numbers. And they go out to look at the land, and they go north. They pass through the hill country of Ephraim. They come to the house of someone named Micha, and they spend the night there. And when they're spending the night there, they hear the voice of a young Levite, and they turned there and asked him, "So what brought you here, and what are you doing in this place, and why are you here?" And he told them what Micah had done for him. "Micha has hired me, and I am his priest." And they ask the priest, "Please inquire of God to learn whether our journey will be successful." And the priest answers, "Go in peace, your journey has the Lord's approval." Well, that's very convenient. So the 5 men come to Laish, which is the original name of where they're scouting out. And they saw the people are living there in safety like the Sidonians, at peace and secure. And since their land lacked nothing, they were prosperous. Also, they lived a long way from the Sidonians and had no relation with anyone else. Now, in the Hebrew version, that doesn't make too much sense. So we hear about the Sidonians, that they're a long way from the Sidonians, but in Hebrew it says, "Devar ein lehem im Adam." And that doesn't make sense in this particular context. What a number of scholars have suggested is that there's a scribal error here, and that originally it said Aram with a resh instead of Adam. And then we have a geopolitical description of Laish's situation. They are not entangled with alliances with the Sidonians and not with the Arameans, who are to the east. In any case, they go back home to Tzora and Eshtaol, and the elders ask them, okay, so what did you find? Is there any place for us to go? And the Danites said, yes, there's a great place, lots of water, lots of land, and we can take this, and there's no reason not to go and put it and do it. So 600 men of the Danites, armed for battle, set out from Tzora and Eshtaol. They set up camp in Kiryat Yarim, which is around the area of Abu Ghosh of today. And that's why here's another midrashem, or a history of a name. It's called Machane Dan whenever this was being written down. People knew about a place that's called Machane Dan, the camp of Dan. So they go up to the hill country of Ephraim, which is in Samaria of today, and they come to Micha's house. And then the 5 men who spied out the land of Laish said to their fellow Danites, you know, in one of those houses, there's a priest, and he has an ephod, and he has household gods and an image. He has all kinds of ritual material that we're going to make use of. So you know what to do, right? So they go into the house, and they took all those ritual objects, and they tell the Levite, they say to him, hey there, how you doing? And they ask him, and they tell him, you know, you should come with us. We're going to be good for you, and you can be a priest to a tribe of Israel and not just some guy's house in the land of Ephraim. So they take all the ritual items, and the priest says, well, wait a second, what are you doing? And they said, no, you're coming with us. You're right, you're coming with us. He gets the hint, but the text tells us the priest was very pleased. Now, the writer of this is not present. This is an editorial comment. He has to be pleased, right? Because he's complicit in what is actually considered a negative thing. He's going with the tribe of Dan, these bullies, and he's putting his lot in with them. So the Danites leave the household of Micha, they continue north, and they put the children and the livestock and their possessions in front of them because they're worried that somebody's come up from behind and maybe there's going to be a fight. So when the people of Micha's house come and they come to the Danites and say, what are you doing? You're taking our priests with you? And you're called, and the Danites say to Micha, what's the matter with you, dude? You called out, you want to have a fight? These guys are tough. And he says, you took my gods, you took my priests. What am I supposed to do? And the Danites said, don't argue with us. Close your mouth. Some of our men might get angry and attack you. And so Micha backs down, and that's the end of that. So the Danites go north to Laish. And the writer of the text once again says, these are people that are at peace and secure. They didn't do any harm to anybody. And the Danites attacked them and with a sword and burned down the city. And there was no one to rescue them because they're too far from Sidon, and the city was in a valley near Beit Rechov. We don't know exactly where that was. It might be the northern part of the Chula Valley or the Ayun Valley in Lebanon. So the Danites built their city. They call it Dan after their ancestor Dan, who was born in Israel. Well, we knew that, right? Why do we have to mention that? Probably because a lot of people knew that the Danites did not have their origins in Israel, and the city used to be called Laish. So they set up the ritual objects. They build a temple there, or sort of a ritual place. And the priest is Jonathan, son of Gershom, son of Moses. He's the grandson of Moses. And his sons were priests for the tribe of Dan until the time of the captivity of the land. So now we know when this was written down. It had to have been written down after the captivity, the destruction of Samaria in 721, 722 BCE. This text was written down after that. And they continued to use the idol Micah had made all the time. The house of God was in Shiloh, in the land of Ephraim, or in the Samaria of today. So this was a bad thing. Okay, so Dan migrates to the north, up to where the circle is in the tribal allotment map. We identify, and this has already been since the 19th century, Tel Dan, the place of Laish, with Tel el Kadi. Kadi means judge in Arabic, so the name works very well in that respect. We also have an inscription from the Hellenistic period which talks about a god who is in Dan. So the identification is almost 100%. There is the red dot on the map is where Tel Dan is located at the foothills of Mount Hermon. Note that if you want to go between the Phoenician coast, Tyre, and you want to get to the inland side of Damascus, actually the road goes right by Tel Dan, which makes it a very important strategic location. So here's a plan of Tel Dan and the excavation areas. We're going to focus on Area B, which is near where you would go up through the gates and enter the town above on the top of the Tel. Here's what it looks like if we're looking northeast. There's Mount Hermon in the background, and here is the excavated area. If you visit Tel Dan today, this is sort of what you will see with some additional signage and fences and things like that. The period that we're going to be focusing on here, since we are talking about the parallels to the book of Judges, to Judges 18, etc., is going to be in this range between sort of 1150 and 950 BCE, so a period of about 200 years. Here's one of the excavation sections of Area B, excavated as a picture from the 1970s, excavated by Avram Biran. You can see how we excavate with the bulks, like we talked about in the first session. And lots of very well-preserved architecture, pits, floors, things like that. Looking up closer in one of these excavated areas, one of the things that became very clear with Biran's excavations is that stratum 5, which dates to about 1100 BCE, which fits pretty well with the narrative of the book of Judges, and Avram Biran was an archaeologist who was a biblical archaeology in the traditional sense. There's a massive destruction layer of this stratum, stratum 5. It's about 70 centimeters thick, 80 centimeters thick, and it contains all kinds of objects that were found in situ in the excavation. For Biran, this really resonated because this was the destruction wrought by the tribe of Dan. Here are some of the things that were found in this destruction. Complete vessels that were later restored in our labs, craters, cooking pots, large storage vessels, pithoi, storage jars, alabastra, flasks. Note that there's not a lot of decoration in this pottery. It's fairly simple and straightforward. In other periods, like the late Bronze Age, just before, you had lots of decoration on the wares. Here, there's a little bit, and it's mostly confined to alabastra and flasks. And even then, not so much. So all of this stuff is found in this destruction layer. We have hundreds and hundreds of complete vessels that have been restored over the years. Here is an archaeological picture, and this is going to get a little wonky, archaeologically speaking, but this is how we work. At the very bottom of the sequence here, we have a late Bronze Age stratum, way down there below. And then above that, we have the very end of the late Bronze Age, which is a plaster floor, which was paved or laid over everything else. And then we have an early Iron Age phase with a pit that pierced through that plaster floor. And then above that, we have a paved floor that goes with the wall behind it and a few other things. So there's a sequence of basically 4 contexts or strata here, and this was found almost throughout the entire site. One of the big problems we have archaeologically is there are so many pits in this stratum that you don't always know where to put your pit stratigraphically. Where does it belong? Does it go with the house with the walls, or does it go, is it underneath? And here is an archaeological section drawing which shows how this works and how we arrive at a conclusion about these kinds of things. So the pits are labeled 6, and you can see they pierce down through the late Bronze Age of stratum 7, and above them is stratum 5 with that massive destruction and the floors that go with the walls. So here's a sort of a 3-part sequence. There's lots of pits in Area B, more than 40. Here are a few of them. One of the questions that was asked from the very beginning, and other scholars have dealt with this as well, is what did these pits contain and how do we know? Well, today we're pretty sure that they were mostly for grain storage. Some of them could be silage pits, they could be for waste, but a couple have been found in places like Tel Dan in the Akko Plain, Tel Shiloh in the Central Hill Country. Also at Tel Dan, some hikers a few years ago in winter walked past one of our sections and saw one of these pits with grain in it. Unfortunately, they didn't take any pictures. They just told me a couple years later. One of the problems here is that some of these pits contained lots of pottery, almost complete vessels, and I emphasize here almost. When Biran interpreted these pits, he thought that they might be receptacles for the storage of household items left there by semi-nomads who left to pasture their flocks, let's say in the summer, in the hill country, and then came back down in the winter and then retrieved their goods. And so he was following the lead of Yigal Yadin, who had the same interpretation for pits at Hatzor. But when I looked at these, it turned out that there's always a bunch missing of these vessels. It's not 100% complete, and some of the pieces are up above, are in the benches, they're in the paving of the floors, and so it occurred to me that this is rubbish. Secondary use of the pits, which were now empty, rubbish was thrown into them, and then it was buried. So if we look at this stratigraphically, the big picture here, just in Area B, but this is true for the other areas excavated at Tel Dan. Stratum 6, the first Iron Age 1, early Iron Age stratum, which dates to about maybe 1200 to 1150 BCE, 1150 to 1100 BC. There's lots of pits. Those are little gray circles you see on the plan, and very little architecture. So there's an open space with pits that are used to hide the grain from people who might want to take it. This is a period of insecurity. In the next stratum, stratum 5, look at the plan. The gray circles are much fewer in number. In stratum 5, there's lots of buildings. It's very dense. The bit in the middle that is empty was left unexcavated. Now we've excavated it, you would be able to fill in that gap. And there are very few pits, maybe one per household, and lots of pithoi, or large storage vessels. So something has changed. I've suggested that the security situation improved, allowing people to store their grain above ground rather than hiding it below ground. But you always have a pit, just to make sure. Here are the pithoi that we find in these rooms that are arrayed in the Skirball Museum in Jerusalem. What did they contain? Where were they made? Who made them? These are all questions that a number of scholars have asked and tried to answer. I have my own take on it. There are two basic kinds of pithoi. The one on the left is a wider mouth pithos with handles on the shoulders. The ones on the right are about the same size, but they're shaped differently, and the handles are on the sides. And the pictures show how they are found in situ, in corners against the walls of houses. Pithoi later they break after a generation or two or three or four, and then they're in secondary use. You use the top of it as a cooking range, and in this case, I think it's a latrine. The top of the pithoi would make a very comfortable seat, and there was a lot of very gray, greenish material at the bottom of this. It wasn't analyzed back in the 70s, but I think it was a latrine. It's an idea. So this is an array of dense architecture in stratum 5 with lots of pithoi located against the walls. And this is probably for the storage of different things, not just grain, which came about instead of pits, but also liquids, oil, and wine, probably lots of that. And these were commercial items that Dan made its living by. I want to look at a particular area now where you find assemblages of vessels that give away the function of some of these buildings. So here, for example, there's a room that contained lots of jugs, and clearly they're pouring liquid, water, wine, something else, but it's in large quantities, together with grinding stones. Here's a large assemblage of grinding stones for grinding things. Some of them are for grain, but others are for pounding and breaking and some kind of industrial activity. And in this room, a little off to the side, a lot of burning is going on. Here we also have crucibles for metallurgy. We'll look at the next slide. The cooking pot fragments that are very blackish and charred were parts of furnaces. They lined the bodies of furnaces. Here's one of those furnaces. And if you look carefully in the circle items, you have these two long ceramic pipes, which are blowpipe nozzles for pumping in forced air into a furnace to raise the heat so that you could melt or smelt metal. And what's happening at Tel Dan in this period is that there is a recycling metallurgy. It's something actually we find throughout the country. In this is maybe one of the best assemblages we have, where you have crucibles, the bowl-shaped objects, where the scrap metal is placed inside the crucible and then melted at a very high temperature. Even some green nodules are still left in some of these crucibles. The pipes, the nozzles are located, they're the long snake-shaped items. You have some scrap metal at the lower left-hand side, and some actual metal objects were also found here before they had been melted. Here's some examples of late Bronze Age spear butts, a lugged axe head. These are things that had been scavenged from somewhere in the region. We don't know exactly from where, but these were used for recycling. These are not the product of the melting and the casting. Now, the metallurgy takes place around this building, but not inside of it. And inside of this building, it's a rectangular shaped building, and in the corner is something very interesting. There was found an assemblage of vessels. This would be called a cella, or sort of a holy of holies. And inside of this corner installation were a series of vessels that were excavated, and this is what they look like after they've been restored. When you find chalices like the one on the left, you're usually looking at something that's ritual in intention. The vessel in the middle, I think, is a model silo, and I think it's the attribute of the grain god, which would either be Baal or perhaps Dagon. Both mentioned in the biblical text, but we know them from texts outside of the Bible as well. And these would have been the main gods of this area in the early Iron Age, the late Bronze Age. My guess is that there would have been a metal statuette placed inside of this model silo. In addition to that, located once again around the temple or the sanctuary that we just looked at, there is a series of items that give away its possible ethnic identification. One of these is this bird's head, which is clearly part of a bird bowl. Here's a complete example that was found at the Philistine site of Tel Kasila in the south, in the grounds of the Eretz Israel Museum. But we also find quite a bit of pottery like this that have birds' heads on them and necks, and just complete birds, including their wings, when we find a larger fragment. There's quite a bit of this, and that is something quite unusual in the north, and we'll explain why in a second. If you go about 40 meters to the east, there's another neighborhood, and in that neighborhood we have something else completely. In that neighborhood, we don't have the birds' heads, we don't have the sea people pottery, we don't have the metallurgy, but we have something else. We have a matzeva, a standing stone. And in fact, in this area, this neighborhood to the east, there are two rooms that have a matzeva set up against the walls. A matzeva is actually a very ancient Near Eastern object that is of ritual importance. It may be used for communications with deities or to mark an event or something like that. Here's an example from early Bronze Age Arad. Middle Bronze Age Tel Gezer, which you can see today. Both of these things you can see today. The late Bronze Age temple at Hatzor, which is now reconstructed at the Israel Museum. And here we have a later example from Iron Age Tel Arad. This also has been reconstructed at the Israel Museum. So this is the hoary tradition that goes way back in the ancient Near East and in the Levant. This idea of standing stones, it's not so much something that goes with the Aegean world or with that pottery that we saw before in the western neighborhood. If we look at the animal bones, digging into the things that these people did on a day-to-day basis, we find that there's a consistent presence of cattle, which means that these people are not nomads. Nomads in the Levant do not herd cattle, they have sheep and goat. So these people are sedentary. They are working the land, they are plowing the land, they are not wanderers, they're not nomads. There is a dominance of sheep and goats, but there's always cattle. When you get to the more dense layers, stratum 5 and 4b, you have a lot more sheep than goat. And that is probably because sheep are more valuable. They're less hardy in difficult climatic conditions, but they give more meat and their wool is better. So it's preferred if you have the right circumstances. There are very few horses or donkeys and a few wild game animals. They're doing some hunting, not a lot. Most interestingly, there are no pigs. We have thousands of animal bones and no pigs. So there must be a pork taboo in place here. And that's interesting in and of itself, because as you will see, I'm going to claim that there are people that come from the Aegean area, the Cypriot area. These are the original Danites. But there's another element here, which is probably local, and there is a pork taboo already circa 1100 BCE at Tel Dan. The paleobotanical remains there used to be not so many, but now we have olive pits, charcoal from trees. Since 2016, when we did a more intensive microarchaeology program, we have grain, both barley and wheat. We have lentils, chickpeas, which I didn't list here, grape pips. So we have like a whole range of Mediterranean foodstuffs that we still consume today, of course. Here is a stamp seal that is carved in a linear style. It used to be called an anchor seal, but actually I think that was a misnomer. What this shape is actually intending is to replicate a loom weight. And it's a particular kind of loom weight which begins to appear in late Bronze Age Cyprus, not in the Levant, it's Cypriot. And then it becomes very common and it becomes the standard kind of loom weight in the Persian Hellenistic period. But it begins apparently in Cyprus circa 1400 or so BCE. And here we have a seal that looks like a loom weight, and it may have been used for actually sealing packages of textiles, which would have been an important part of the economy of Dan in the early Iron Age. So we have this great destruction in stratum 5. We have other carbon organic materials from other stratum as well. Stratum 5 is the really good one. And this gives up carbon 14 dates. We can analyze these. So when I look at the dates, and on the left side of the chart we have the before present dates, and on the bottom we have the sample numbers. Each line, each bar is a sample of carbon 14. These are all or almost all on charcoal, on wood, and wood is a problem. We now have better dates that come from grains because grains are annuals. They give you 1 year, the year of harvest, whereas a piece of charcoal could come from a tree that's already 50, 100 years old when it was harvested, and so that only gives you the date when it was cut down. And when we look at the dates and we average them out in a chart that looks like this is something we talked about in the first talk, we get a range of dates that ranges between about 1270 and 1130 BCE, which is quite early for the Iron Age 1, the early Iron Age. My sense is that since these are almost all of charcoal, what we're looking at is the date when trees were chopped down to make the roofs of houses. And I actually think that this may be wood that was salvaged from an earlier stratum, stratum 6 or stratum 7a, and reused in the stratum 5 houses to build these houses. And our grain analysis that we have now, the annual seeds tell us that they're a little bit later, or quite a bit later than these dates, so we actually have a bracket. The building date, or at least of the houses from the earlier period, and then the destruction date. that are not presented here. This is just the charcoal. So we have dates, we have a little bit about the ethnic orientations of peoples. Here we have a little bit about Iron 1 foodways. Here we have a typical Levantine Iron 1 cooking pot with the rim that is splayed outwards and then pulled down. This is a large cooking pot. But we also have these strange smaller cooking pots that are probably mostly for something liquid, maybe some kind of cream of wheat or something. We have hundreds of these, and this is a scale that no other site in the Levant has. And it's an Egyptian cooking pot. When you go to Egypt, there's lots of these. In the Levant, very few. In Tel Dan, there are hundreds of them. Tens of them have been mended as complete vessels. So we have these two different kinds of vessels, probably for cooking different kinds of things. When I look at the big kind of cooking pots, and I checked the diameters of several hundred of them using the rims, it turned out that there are basically two different modes. There's a very large cooking pot, those are the high bars on the left, and smaller ones that are on the right. But what's interesting here is that in the earlier strata, or in stratum 5 at least, you have quite a few of these really large ones, and then as time goes by, you have fewer of the really large ones. And this tells me that people are eating in larger numbers together, extended family meals, as opposed to smaller family meals a little later on in stratum 5 and stratum 4b. This is a crater. Traditionally, they are explained as being something where you mix liquids like beer or wine with other things, and it's for liquids. But I have a feeling that some of these, especially the ones that have only one handle, are actually chamber pots. And this is something that still needs to be checked using organic chemistry to check to see if there are the remains of human fecal matter, for example, or urine. This is something that still needs to be done. It's not always possible. It doesn't always preserve well. But I think that some of these are actually chamber pots, and you would have to label these very well so as not to confuse the chamber pots with the craters that are used for mixing liquids for drinking. So, who were the inhabitants of Tel Dan? So we have the Sea People pottery. Here's a sample of that was published in the final report in 2019, with lots of birds and a few other motifs that are typically sea people. But most of this is not like the Philistine pottery we know about from the southern coastal plain, from sites like Ekron, Gat, Ashdod, Ashkelon. It's not quite the same. There are a few pieces that are, and when these were analyzed by David Ben Shlomo of Ariel University, it turned out that a couple of these pieces actually were imports from the south. But most of the rest of the stuff is locally made. This is an earlier vessel, a vessel that's a Mycenaean 3C stirrup jar. We don't know exactly where it's from. It was found in the very last late Bronze Age level, so circa 1200 to 1150 or so BCE. One analysis of neutron activation suggests that it might come from the Mediterranean coast of Turkey. It's a possibility, but we don't know for sure. But this is representative of the first phase of Aegean-style pottery that reaches the Levant. It's one of three pieces that we have at Tel Dan. In the south, in the area of Philistia, we have a lot more, and there's a sequence of development of these kind of decorated wares. So at Dan, we do have the Sea People connection with birds and on the pottery in the bird bowl. By the way, the lower two shards are the Philistine-style pottery that comes from the south, but they're the only ones. Decorated Philistine pottery looks like this usually. If you look carefully at the bird on this vessel, you will note that the neck of the bird, the bird's head is turned towards its tail feathers. The neck is made with two lines. And there are other motifs here, a checkerboard pattern, a lotus motif, things like that, which are typical of the Philistine pottery. This is not what most of the Tel Dan pottery looks like. When we look at the Philistine bichrome pottery throughout Philistia, all of these birds have, or almost all of them have, the two lines to form the neck. But when you look at the earlier pottery from the Mycenaean 3C, from around the Aegean world, from Turkey, from Cyprus, from Greece, and from the Mediterranean coast of Syria and Israel, the birds that you have usually have one line for the neck. So my theory here is that while we recognize this pattern of development from Philistia, where you have the monochrome pottery that is just one color, brown, black, swirls and designs, and that develops into a bichrome kind of pottery. In the north, you have the same sequence, but the birds and the motifs are a little bit different. The birds are painted with one line, just like the birds in Cyprus and the birds from Greece. These are sea peoples that have an Aegean Cypriot connection, but they're not Philistines. Another aspect of the same picture is this so-called Galilean pithos that is found in large quantities at Tel Dan. More than anything else, it looks like the pithoi from Cyprus. A few more of these have been found at sites like Tel Dan in the Shvela, but they are characteristic of Ugarit, of Tyre, of coastal sites for the most part, and of Cyprus and of the Eastern Mediterranean coastline. And this style, this technique reached Tel Dan, and somebody who knew how to make these, a potter, was resident at Tel Dan using local materials. And they made hundreds of these. Looking once again at the temple and that corner sanctuary, it's reminiscent of the sanctuaries we find at Tel Kasila, for example, that have these corner holies of holies in them. Here's the latest one from Stratum 10. This would be probably early 10th century BC or so, another corner holy of holies. And if we look at the larger scheme of things, temples from all over the place, from Cyprus, from Greece, and from the coast of Israel, places like Tel Kasila, you'll see that the pattern of these corner holies of holies, the corner cella, is very prominent in most of these. So what I'm getting at here, of course, is that the little temple at Tel Dan, surrounded by metallurgy, is also one of these Aegean-style, Cypriot-style temples. To make the point even clearer, if we look at a couple sites in Cyprus, we'll look at Kition and Enkomi, two of the major sites from the late Cypriot or late Bronze Age period, merging into the early Iron Age. Here's an aerial photograph of Kition, near Larnaca. Here's the temple complex at Kition. The black dots, by the way, the markings on the plans, are evidence of recycling metallurgy. So there's a parallel right there. But if you look at the temples 2 and temple 5, you will see also that corner holy of holies in these temples. In this bronze stand, fragment of a bronze stand that was on display at the Bible Lands Museum, you will see ingots carried by these guys. The provenance of this is not 100% clear. It's thought to be a Cypriot four-sided stand, but it's from the antiquities market, so we really don't know for sure. But assuming that it is genuine, you see the oxide ingots, which are characteristic of Cypriot extractive metallurgy, smelting and casting, and right below them is the bird. So the bird occurs in these Eastern Mediterranean contexts, maritime and metallurgy contexts. Moving a little further north to the site of Enkomi, note how it's planned in a grid, so it's a planned city, a big city, going way back to the late Cypriot period. We're talking about 1200, 1300, 1400 BC. Here's a plan of what the city would have looked like, or the portions that were excavated. And in Enkomi, there was also a temple that has one of those corner holies of holies. And this is what was found inside that corner holy of holies, a statue of the ingot god. Notice that he's standing on an oxide ingot, representing the metallurgy of Cyprus, for what is so well known. The word copper comes from Kypros, Cyprus. So, if we're moving along to other aspects of life and death at Tel Dan, one of the big questions is where are the remains of the dead? And in fact, there are no tombs at Tel Dan, 0 from this period. But in fact, there are almost no tombs anywhere in the southern Levant. The few that we do find seem to be remnants of Bronze Age behaviors that survived a century or two later, but for the most part, most people stopped burying their dead with accompanying objects. They stopped carving big tombs. They were probably burying their dead in open pits in the fields. So this is true almost everywhere. And by the way, even in the Philistine region, there are almost no tombs in this early Iron Age period, circa 1200 to 1000 BCE. Why would that be? It's not something I'm going to go into detail right now. I have a feeling it's related to the recycling metallurgy, the idea that tombs were being scavenged, were being plundered in order to find metals because there were shortages, and that as a result, and because also people were scavenging old temples, Canaanite temples, and taking the god figurines, the deities, out in order to melt them to make tools and weapons, that this also forwarded an idea of anachonism that becomes so prominent in the Hebrew Bible. But this is another topic that is a subject for another session, another place, another time. So, who were the Danites? Probably, and this is not my idea, this is something that Yigal Yadin, Otniel Margalit, Michael Astor came up with already in the 60s and 70s. The name sounds like a name of a tribe or an ethnic group that we know of from the Egyptian texts called the Danuna or the Denyen. And the name was shortened and it became Dan. And these are sea peoples that we know about. They probably were originally located in the Aegean coast of Anatolia, maybe the area that's called Adana today. This is one theory. It's a theory, it's a hypothesis. But to me, it makes a good deal of sense. By the way, there is, in Greek mythology, there's an ethnic group called the Danae. Perseus was a Danae. And what is the story we know about best from the narrative of Perseus? He saves Andromeda. Where does this take place? In an island off the coast of Jaffa. There you have it. I think that they were partly from the Aegean coast of Anatolia, perhaps, but also there certainly is a Cypriot element amongst these people who lived at Tel Dan. But let's not forget, there were local people here in numbers. The local style cooking pots represent probably women who do most of the cooking in traditional societies, who perhaps had married local men who served at the site at the time. And most likely, there were also Egyptians there, especially priests. So there's something foreign and something threatening about the Danites, according to the biblical account. They are a tribe of Israel, but maybe they were added a little bit later, and that's why there was the need to make that point in various places in the text. They're highly regarded as craftsmen. And Judges 18 is a very special, interesting adventure story, but it has its own message. It's quite clear that it was written long after the story is purported to take place. It was written at a time when there was a temple in Jerusalem, when the strength of the clergy was especially in the temple in Jerusalem, and the temple in Dan was considered to be a sin, the sin of Jeroboam. And the reason that all the terrible things that happened to Israel, and that is hinted at by the very end of Judges 18, where this was written down clearly after the exile took place from the north, but before the Babylonian exile. Thanks very much. Next session we'll deal with sort of a cumulative account of looking at the things that we talked about before. We'll talk about how Israel as a whole began. That's the culmination of all of this. So I hope you'll join us for that. Thank you very much.